Time back, I'd begun a series of presentations, really only completing the first of them, on the subject of the mystery of the Trinity. The assumption of that presentation and of the hope for future presentations is that a person considering those short explanations are open to thinking about the mystery of the Trinity from the standpoint of Christian faith. Obviously, if a person doesn't accept Christian faith, the mystery of the Trinity is not going to be particularly interesting to them. Now, on the other hand, a person who is critical of Christian faith might want to look at the mystery of the Trinity as a way of undermining Christianity and say that it's based upon an incoherent or an illogical doctrine or teaching. And in that sense, objections to that or criticisms of the Christian belief are worthy of consideration if a person takes Christian faith to be consistent with human reason. In other words, it's not a violation of human reason. It might be that the truths of Christianity exceed human reason in the sense that we can't demonstrate them through reason alone. There are plenty of things that we're incapable of demonstrating through reason alone. For example, especially if we want to limit ourselves to certain kinds of reasonable arguments. For instance, if a person wanted to limit himself to a deductive type of argument, one that would be characteristic of mathematics, let's say, then that would obviously exclude any kind of historical argument or argument from induction, where you're gathering up sense data of particular things and drawing some kind of general conclusion. The sort of thing that we do all the time and that we do all day long. Furthermore, it would seem to exclude personal sorts of experiences, like, for example, the recognition that another person that I'm relating to loves me or cares for me. This is not the sort of thing that is susceptible to mathematical demonstration. It's based upon a certain personal trust or experiential sort of basis that we have. So in other words, the point that I'm making here is that there are many different ways of trying to demonstrate something or to prove something. Some of those yield probability, some of them yield a kind of deductive certitude. All of them, by the way, include some type of initial premises that a person accepts or presuppositions that are involved in the knowing process or in the process of committing oneself to a certain conclusion. But in any case, in response to the video that I made on the Trinity, one gentleman wrote a very lengthy response to that, and rather than try to respond in writing, which it seems fewer people would like to read long writings nowadays, rather than listen to perhaps a short presentation, I'd like to begin in this presentation responding to some of his criticisms of the remarks that I made. And rather than just reply to them as just trying to just reply to those objections, hopefully by responding to them, it will help to clarify more some of the points that I was trying to make in my initial presentation. So let's see how this goes. The first criticism that he made is by looking for some type of proof or demonstration of a statement that I made in the video. The statement was, the human mind is incapable of fully penetrating the essence of God. And he was looking for some kind of citation for that. Furthermore, even of the idea that there is some kind of essence of God that it is either possible or impossible to understand. The first thing I would say in response to that is that in the video I was trying to rush through certain things that most people in the realm of theology, especially thinking about the mystery of the Trinity, take those things sort of as proven points or as agreed upon points from prior discussions or prior conclusions. What I was trying to do in the relatively short video that I made was to gather up some of those conclusions and try to present some of them in the video. But perhaps it's a good idea to back up and think a little bit about, in this case, what is the basis of saying that the human mind is incapable of fully penetrating the essence of God? And there are a lot of different ways of going about doing this, but let me just suggest one to you. In the Thomistic tradition, that is the tradition that sort of follows the line of thinking of St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, one of the really great theologians of the church, but not only St. Thomas, but really the whole flow of Christian theology is based upon the first principle or recognition that God is supreme. God is absolute. God is the source of the sensory, material, changing world, but God himself is not one of those changing, sensory, finite things. If God is not one of those sensory finite things, and how we would arrive at that conclusion, I would suggest to you is through a process of, you could do it through a process of reasoning. For instance, if you take a first cause argument or a cosmological argument, it leads us to the recognition that there's a first reality from which everything else comes, or upon which everything else depends. Now, if there is such a first reality that transcends the sensory world as we know it, St. Thomas would tell us that all of our knowledge as human beings begins in sense experience. It begins through the experience of finite temporary things, changing things, that in turn point us to an unchanging first reality that transcends all of the things that our senses are comfortable with dealing with. In other words, my senses are comfortable sort of wrapping themselves around a finite object in front of me. However, to get my senses or even my mind to wrap around realities that absolutely transcend the world of finite sensory things, the mind begins to break down and shows its limitations. It tries to reach the ultimate realities, or the ultimate reality in this case of God. It tries to reach it because of the desire of the mind to know. We want to understand things. But what we find is, as we try to know and try to understand, we can't reach it. That I think is a little bit of the background to this statement that the human mind is incapable of fully penetrating the essence of God. It's because God is the kind of reality that is far beyond the comfort zone of the human mind in grasping or wrapping itself around finite things. Now, if that's the case, that leads us to the second point, which is the second question that was raised is about a statement that I made, that we know that there is a reality that is beyond the capacities of our mind, and the writer asked for a source of that claim as well. That too was a conclusion of prior argumentation or of other reasoning, and I would point again to a first cause kind of argument, that I would suggest that the world of changing things about us implies an unchanging ground or source. Change itself, or motion in the world, implies a giver, a source, a reason for that change. And so when something happens, we look for some type of causal explanation of that happening. The whole universe is the outworking of all of the energy that is present in it. That energy, from what we understand, is being reduced to lower and lower levels of utility or usefulness. Eventually, at least we're told, the universe dying a heat death. But Aquinas, of course, and others who have used this argument didn't have to depend on contemporary science to draw their conclusions. Their conclusion is simply that a world of changing things implies an unchanging reality that gives it source, that gives it its ground, and is its ultimate impetus or its ultimate mover. Now, if that argument is sound, and I think that it is, and elsewhere I've argued for it, if that argument is sound, then it supports, or it grounds the conclusion that I made and that this author is reacting to, that there is a first reality, and I have reason to believe that, and also that that first reality transcends the power of the human mind to fully comprehend or grasp. Okay, the third point that the author raises is that to the statement that I made, that the scriptures speak to us of there only being one God. And he goes on to cite several references of Scripture that refer to other gods. For example, in Exodus 23, make no mention of the name of other gods, neither let it be heard out of thy mouth. And so on. There are various other references. And so he draws the conclusion from this that in the Bible it not only refers to there only being one God, but it also refers to other gods, and therefore it contradicts itself internally. In response to that, I think this is a confusion, of a very important confusion. Yes, the Bible does speak of other gods, because obviously other people believed in other gods. It's a stretch, though, to go from the recognition that other people believed in other gods to the claim that the Bible is affirming the real existence of those gods. In other words, I think there's a confusion here between what we might call epistemology and ontology. Epistemology has to do with what one knows or what one thinks, and ontology has to do with reality, what reality is. The Bible does not deny that people believed in many gods, but what it does is forbids the people who follow the biblical God from believing in those gods, trusting in those gods, building idols to those gods, and so on. And so this idea that because the Bible refers to these gods, therefore it's affirming their existence, I think is a mistake, a significant mistake. And there are plenty of references in the Bible that refer to the non-existence of these various deities, even though people worship them. Furthermore, he tries to make a big point here about all of this being some kind of contradiction, that, that this is the Bible then has these contradictions in it, and therefore it's unreliable. I think his approach, at least based on what he's written here, his approach is an unfair one that is looking for fault or looking for contradiction rather than trying to find a way of reconciling or putting these things together. In other words, the kind of charitable approach that we might have to another person who's talking to us, and we're trying to take what they say and put it together in a coherent whole. Instead, he's approaching it, I think, looking for ways of setting things up in opposition with each other. He concludes his writing, and there's a lot more in between that I'll have to get to later on, but he concludes his writing with a series of scriptures that he says contradict the belief in the Trinity. As I go through those various references, and I could spend 45 minutes or more in presentations like this going through all those particular references of Scripture, but as I go through them, many of them are texts that are used to support and to elaborate on and to provide foundation for the belief in the Trinity. What he's doing is reading those texts or looking at those texts. Probably the reality is cutting and pasting those texts from some other source, but he's looking at those particular texts and making them out to be somehow in opposition to the belief in the Trinity. Whereas all it would take is a simple recognition, for example, that in the belief in the Trinity, we believe that Jesus is the incarnation of the Son of God, who is both God and man, two natures, one person. Now, if you come to understand that, almost every one of the verses of Scripture that he gave, especially those from the New Testament, are easily explainable. If you ignore the incarnation, if you ignore the Christian understanding of who Jesus is, and then you try to just create semantical conflicts, then of course you're going to run into problems. But the problems are not real with respect to the doctrine of the Trinity as properly understood. So there I will stop for the moment, but later I will return to the many other points that he made on this, just as a way of trying to understand a little bit more of the foundations for some of the things that I was saying in the prior presentation.